Hi everybody, my name is Rachel Garnham and I'd like to welcome you to this Arise Festival event discussing Sylvia Pankhurst, Suffragette, Socialist and Scourge of the Empire. Today's forum is hosted by Labour Outlook, which is a fast-growing website bringing you daily news and views from across the left and those at the forefront of resisting the Tories. And it's part of the Socialist Ideas series of discussions, more information about which will be posted in the chat during the event. So those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it, and we can't hope to transform the world without understanding it. So I'm really looking forward to, I'm really enjoying this series of discussions and looking forward to the other Friday discussions coming up on Marx and Engels, plus the Paris Commune. But today, for me, what looked like the highlight of this Festival of Ideas, the great Sylvia Pankhurst. So to discuss Sylvia's relevance today, we're joined by Katherine Connelly, a writer, historian and expert on Sylvia Pankhurst. She is the author of Sylvia Pankhurst, Suffragette, Socialist and Scourge of Empire, and editor of A Suffragette in America, Reflections on Prisoners, Pickets and Political Change. From militant suffragette at the beginning of the 20th century to an early voice on the dangers of fascism, to a campaigner against colonialism in Africa after the Second World War, Sylvia Pankhurst dedicated her life to fighting oppression and injustice. And this event's going to look at how this courageous and inspiring campaigner is hugely relevant to socialists and those engaged in social movements today. And not just socialists and social movements, but to everyone, and women in particular, who want a better world. Just as an aside, my daughter was put in Pankhurst House at her new school last year. And although the picture that they had in her school was of Emmeline Pankhurst, I was pleased to explain that it was Sylvia who needed to be her inspiration and role model. And on her continued relevance, just last week at my local Labour women's meeting, we were discussing motions to send to Labour's Women's Conference in October, and we referenced the suffragettes and women protesters over the ages in our motion that we're sending to defend the right to protest, which is as relevant today as it was 100 years ago, 200 years ago. So really looking forward to how we can bring the history of Sylvia and what she achieved and make it relevant for today for everyone. So we want to have as many questions and comments from the audience as possible in the chat, and please do also let us know where you're tuning in from, because we know that people are joining us from all around the world. We'll have time for a few rounds of questions from the audience after the speakers, and during the event you can also tweet at Labour Outlook, which is at Labour Outlook, and Arise Festival at Arise_Festival. And if you can, please also donate at the link provided. And if you haven't done so already, make sure you buy a ticket for the whole of Arise, a Festival of Left Ideas, because we do need to sell hundreds of tickets to cover the costs of this amazing month of events that are being put on. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Katherine and ask her to talk to us about Sylvia Pankhurst.
Well, thank you very, very much, Rachel, for that very generous introduction, for such a politically engaged introduction about Sylvia. And thank you very much as well to the organisers of the Arise Festival. It's an absolute pleasure for me to be able to come along and do this, and I very much look forward to hearing about the kind of questions that people have and ideas about Sylvia Pankhurst today. And that's really what I'm going to start off by talking about. Sylvia Pankhurst, as you've just heard, was a lifelong political activist. First of all, in the militant suffragette movement. She was an anti-war campaigner. She opposed the First World War right from the start. She was, for most of her life, a newspaper editor. She edited these extraordinary radical newspapers which pioneered a kind of journalism from below, that tried to give a voice to the voiceless, included much kind of investigative journalism. She was immensely inspired by the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. She was one of the people who smuggled the writings of revolutionary Russians into Britain to spread revolutionary propaganda. And indeed, she went over to Russia. She was denied a passport by the British government, but she managed to get herself smuggled over to Russia in a small fishing boat to go over and debate with Vladimir Lenin, the leader of the Bolshevik Party. She participated in these enormous international gatherings of communists. And again, she had to do this under quite illegal circumstances. She got herself to Italy to partake in the discussions there. And then extraordinarily, she walked over the Alps at night into Germany at a time when the counter-revolution was in the ascendancy there, and met with radicals in their safe houses. She was a lifelong anti-racist, a lifelong anti-imperialist, and one of the first people to identify the dangers of the rise of fascism in Britain. At a time when Winston Churchill was saying that had he been an Italian, he would have voted for Benito Mussolini. Sylvia Pankhurst, who knew a huge amount about Italian politics, was raising awareness about the dangers of fascism and how it represented an existential threat to all of the causes to which she'd committed her life. And it was in her opposition to fascism that led her really to the last great cause of her life, which was campaigning for the freedom of Ethiopia, which had been invaded by fascist Italy in 1935. So she campaigned particularly to raise awareness about what the fascist occupation meant at a time when the British government and the French government were very happy to appease Italian fascism, didn't see a problem with it. Indeed, it looked rather similar to their own colonialism in Africa. So she was campaigning against that to raise awareness about it, and then later on to try and prevent the tentacles of British imperialism attacking Ethiopia, invading Ethiopia as well. And in fact, that's where she ended her life. She went to live out there in the last few years of her life. So Sylvia Pankhurst always remained for the establishment a dangerous suffragette. She was never embraced by them. In contrast, for example, to her mother, Emmeline Pankhurst, who ended her life when she died. She was standing as a candidate for the Conservative Party, and then shortly after she died, a statue to her was unveiled outside Parliament, sort of round the corner, not exactly outside Parliament. In fact, as I'm sure lots of people will know, it took until 2018 for a statue of a woman to appear in Parliament Square itself. But still, that obviously was not going to be of Sylvia Pankhurst. So she always remained somebody who was dangerous for the establishment, not just when she was a suffragette, which is what I'm going to focus on here. But certainly if you go to the National Archives, if you look at what the British state was writing about Sylvia Pankhurst, they spied on her for years. And if you look at the kind of things that they were writing about her, she remained a thorn in their side. And the files on her, which are large and extensive, are filled with the most kind of vile hatred on the behalf of the British establishment. Here is one example that I quote in my book. This is from 1947, and this is written by a Foreign Office official to a British minister in Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia. And he says about Sylvia Pankhurst, "We agree wholeheartedly with you in your evident wish that this horrid old harridan should be choked to death with her own pamphlets." So that was the official view. So if Sylvia Pankhurst wasn't useful for the establishment, it's very interesting, the moments in which Sylvia Pankhurst has been remembered and commemorated, the moments when interest in her has really peaked. One such moment was during the 1970s, at the same time as the women's liberation movement. It was in the 1970s that Sylvia's masterpiece, her wonderful account of the suffragette movement, called The Suffragette Movement, which was first published in 1931, that was republished by Virago Press in the 1970s. It was also in the 1970s that the TV series Shoulder to Shoulder was screened, which really was based on Sylvia's account and defined for a generation the kind of popular memory of the suffragette movement. There were a whole series of books and studies produced on Sylvia Pankhurst in this era, women's liberationists walking the spaces, the sites in East London that Sylvia Pankhurst had been to. And this was because in that period, women's liberationists, especially socialist feminists, were looking for examples from the past in which the campaign for women's rights had been campaigned with the struggle against capitalism. And they were looking for lessons from that struggle about how to wage successful campaigns and how to ensure that their campaigns in the present were going to be ones that could not be co-opted and neutralized by the establishment. So I think it's very interesting that really the sort of second period of intensely revived interest in Sylvia Pankhurst is one that we are now living through. One that comes in the wake of the radicalization of a whole generation of activists through the anti-war movement in this country, at a moment when we are seeing the highest level of industrial struggle since the 1980s. And this time, at a moment when women form the majority inside the trade unions and have been amongst the most militant fighters in the most militant unions in that struggle. At a moment when the kind of nonsense that we were fed in the 1990s about the battle for women's liberation having been won, women having it all, has been exposed for the nonsense that it is. I'm just going to mention a few examples of renewed interest in Sylvia Pankhurst. This won't be exhaustive, and I apologize for that. But for example, just in the last few years, we've seen the publication of Rachel Holmes's masterful biography of Sylvia Pankhurst, really, really detailed, kind of matches the scale and the color of Sylvia Pankhurst's own The Suffragette Movement. We've seen the musical Sylvia at the Old Vic, telling the story of Sylvia Pankhurst through funk and hip hop and soul. The establishment of an East End Women's Museum, which of course has provided a lot of focus on Sylvia Pankhurst and the East London suffragettes. Walks again being done of East London to explore those suffragette sites. Certainly you can do that if you read David Rosenberg's books or go on any of his walks. I do a number of walks of Sylvia Pankhurst, East London, and of course my own work and publications that Rachel talked about Sylvia also, I think, are a part of this sort of moment of renewed interest in Sylvia. So if Sylvia Pankhurst is not useful for the establishment, her life, her political contribution has meaning and provides inspiration for people trying to make changes in the present. And I want to talk a little bit about why that is. Sylvia Pankhurst's formative experience came in the militant suffragette movement. This derived from an organisation established in 1903 by her mother, Emmeline Pankhurst, in Manchester, called the Women's Social and Political Union. And what marked out the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU, right from the start, were the kind of women that it got involved. Whereas previously, the kind of women who were campaigning for the suffrage, for women's suffrage, tended to be liberal or even conservative women, asking for parity with their husbands and their brothers. The Women's Social and Political Union was founded in an area of the country where women were most densely organised into trade unions in the cotton factories in Lancashire, around Manchester, called Cottonopolis. So it involved women trade unionists and women like the Pankhursts, who were from more middle-class backgrounds, who were involved in the early labour movement, the Independent Labour Party, and organisations like that. So that's what distinguished it, first of all. And then just before the 1906 general election, they really distinguished themselves through the kind of tactics that they were using. And those tactics were drawn from the political milieu from which they were founded. They were inspired, for example, by the campaigns around unemployment, which used direct action to draw attention to their struggle. And the Women's Social and Political Union decided this was the kind of thing they were going to do, that instead of asking politely, lobbying, writing letters, all of those kind of things, they themselves were going to use direct action and civil disobedience, what at the time became called militancy, to draw attention to their cause. But the politics of the organisation changed over time. And they rejected those early alliances that they'd made with the labour movement, with the trade unions, as increasingly they courted the support of wealthier women, women that were deemed to be more prominent in society. Of course, the press became far more interested if the women being sent to prison were a name, someone that people knew. And increasingly, an argument was made that it was wrong to rely upon working class women to carry the campaign. The ideals of sacrifice and things like that were invoked. And the way that this was reframed was it was the duty of wealthier women in society to campaign on behalf of their poorer sisters. So essentially a marginalization of working class women from the campaign and exclusion of them on the basis that the things that the vote could be campaigned for by other more privileged women. And along with that came the idea that the campaign should take up only the question of women's issues, should be a single issue campaign focused upon votes for women and not all of the other issues that inspired women to join the campaign in the first place. But what were defined as simply women's issues, in fact, reflected a class experience. It was very easy for upper class women to separate out the issues of low pay, high rents, poor working conditions, all of those things from a political campaign for the vote, or indeed to prioritize the vote and to say this was the most important question for women and the other things could be sorted out once, for example, women were able to become bosses in the workplace or things like that. That wasn't true for working class women. For working class women, these issues were integrally linked. Women's inferior status inside society, which was embodied in the fact that they were denied their citizenship, their right to vote, also justified paying them poverty wages. The experience of living in poverty, of being told that your wage wasn't important because there ought to be a male breadwinner, all of those kind of things exacerbated and defined the experience of women's oppression for working class women. And indeed, giving some more socially privileged men the right to vote hadn't resulted, for example, in the poorest men in society getting a wage rise. So for working class women, the solution was not to rely upon other women to do the fighting for them, but to fight for their immediate empowerment. And those were the kind of conclusions that Sylvia Pankhurst drew in the course of the suffragette movement. That was very difficult, of course, for her, because what that meant was having a confrontation with her mother and her older sister over precisely these questions as they were leading the campaign. Sylvia Pankhurst drew these conclusions in very, very detailed research that she did. She was an artist, and in the course of the suffragette campaign, she undertook this extraordinary tour. She went off from London through the north of England, right up into Scotland, stopping at various places where she would then study the conditions in which working women were working and living, interviewing them about exactly how much they were paid, what their lives were like, and then trying to capture this in paintings. She did a very similar thing in 1911 and 1912 when she undertook 2 lecture tours of the United States. These were lecture tours where she was promoting the suffragette movement in Britain, but at the same time, she ensured that she went round factories, that she went into prisons and colleges, and that she interviewed women, particularly working class women, about the conditions that they were experiencing. And she took up a whole range of other issues as well, including very powerfully looking at racism in the United States. The conclusion that Sylvia Pankhurst drew from her own political position as a socialist and from her own research was that it was self-defeating for the suffragette movement to rely on a very small group of women, elite women in society, and only the elite women that supported Votes for Women at that, to do the fighting on behalf of everybody else. That this was a campaign that was suffering intense state repression and persecution, and that essentially, if they relied on a very small group of women in society, this campaign could be very easily criminalized and shut down. But she also realized there was a positive basis to arguing that this should become a mass campaign rather than an elite campaign. And she drew that conclusion by looking at what was happening at the time. Because at the time Sylvia Pankhurst was making these arguments, Britain was undergoing what we now call the Great Unrest. The Great Unrest lasted from 1910 up until 1914. Just recently been the subject of a book by Ralph Darlington. And the Great Unrest consisted of a massive strike wave that swept this country, that affected all of this country's major infrastructure. There were massive strikes on the docks, on the railways, in the mines, but also in factories, big and small, up and down the country. And it was a revolt essentially against a cost of living crisis which saw thousands of workers take action. So this was the context in which Sylvia Pankhurst was arguing there was the basis for the suffragette movement to forge alliances with masses of people rather than relying on the few. On the one hand, she saw that the Great Unrest, those fighting in the Great Unrest, were facing the same enemy. It was the same government, it was the same Winston Churchill that sent troops to go and fire on striking workers in South Wales. That was the same government, the same Winston Churchill, that sent police to go and attack women's suffrage campaigners in Parliament Square. The same government that was imprisoning suffragettes, that was force-feeding the suffragettes when they went on hunger strike in the prisons. So they had the same enemy, but she also thought that they shared the same interests, that essentially what was at stake in all of these struggles was a struggle for people to determine their own lives. It was a struggle for empowerment, and that therefore there was a real basis for solidarity and for forming those alliances. For Sylvia Pankhurst, her vision of the way in which the vote was going to be won was not by an elite few, supposedly more enlightened than everybody else, telling the government what kind of reforms ought to be enacted. She believed that the vote was only going to be won, or would indeed best be won, if it was forced upon the government by masses of people challenging all of the kind of inequalities inside society. Sylvia Pankhurst was expelled from the WSPU for taking that stance. She was expelled after she stood on the platform at the Albert Hall, obviously an enormous venue, alongside James Connelly, one of the leaders of the trade union struggle in Dublin, where they faced a particularly brutal response from the employers. James Larkin, the leader of that struggle, the leader of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, was imprisoned. And so James Connelly came to Britain to plead for the Trade Union Congress to take action in solidarity with Irish workers. And in that call, Sylvia Pankhurst joined him and linked the issue of women's disenfranchisement with the campaign in Ireland. And it was for taking that stance that she was expelled by her older sister, Christabel Pankhurst, from the suffragette movement. And particularly, as Sylvia remembered it, it was over the kinds of women that Sylvia Pankhurst was organising amongst, because she had gone to East London, which was then as now one of the poorest parts of London, the poorest parts of the city, to organise a working class campaign for the vote. And in response to that, Christabel Pankhurst, this is from Sylvia's book, The Suffragette Movement, Christabel apparently told her, a working women's movement was of no value. Working women were the weakest portion of the sex. How could it be otherwise? Their lives were too hard, their education too meagre to equip them for the contest. Surely it is a mistake to use the weakest for the struggle, she said. We want picked women, the very strongest and most intelligent. So that was Christabel Pankhurst's judgment about what Sylvia Pankhurst was doing in East London about the women that she was working with. So after being expelled, Sylvia Pankhurst and the suffragettes in East London continued to organise. They were now continuing an independent campaign in East London. And what they tried to do as the newly formed East London Federation of Suffragettes was they tried to, in practice, forge those links between the industrial struggle that was taking place and their own struggle for political rights. So they looked to the kind of tactics that were used in industrial struggles. They looked for a kind of militancy that working class women could be at the forefront of. It was very difficult, for obvious reasons, for working class women in large numbers to go to prison as individuals in the struggle. But these women wanted to be part of a militant campaign, and Sylvia Pankhurst knew from the Great Unrest that working class women, of course, had the capacity to take militant action. She'd also drawn the conclusion, unlike Christabel Pankhurst, that far from being the weakest portion of society, that working class women, of course, felt weak when they acted individually, but when they acted collectively, working class women had this huge power to stop production, to stop the production of all of the kind of goods and the running of society. And it was that kind of power they wanted to mobilize. So, for example, one of the tactics that they were agitating for was the idea of a rent strike. Now, in working class households, it was women that paid the rent. So the idea was that they would put pressure on the landlord, saying we're not paying the rent until the vote is granted. And this would be something that would not have to be done by women individually, but would be done as collective, but as a community. So these are one of the things that they did. They learned from James Connelly and the Great Unrest in Dublin. James Connelly had established the Irish Citizens' Army to defend workers when they were facing police brutality whilst on strike. Of course, the suffragettes faced police brutality. So in East London, they formed a People's Army, which used to drill on the streets of East London to defend themselves from the police. And it was also going to be used in the Labour movement as well. But also the kinds of women that they recruited were drawn from the Great Unrest. Melvina Walker, one of their best recruits, one of their best public speakers, was the wife of a striking docker and had participated in that struggle. They recruited women who were involved in a massive strike of women workers at Morton's, a packing factory in Millwall. Actually, it's the factory, I think, that sort of founded Millwall Football Club. So they recruited women from there, but also women who joined the suffragettes in East London, then brought their militant ideas. They became leaders in their own workplaces because they were the women that were trusted to stand up to the boss. So, for example, Annie Lake led a strike at Johnny Walker's bottling factory. Rose Pengelly, a 15-year-old who joined the Junior Suffragettes Club in East London, led a strike at an asbestos works, which must have been a particularly unpleasant place to work.
You've had 25 minutes. Do you want another 5 minutes? Is that okay?
That's all right. I promise to make it just 5. Thank you. Yeah, so Rose Pengelly, this 15-year-old, and all her workmates called her Sylvia in tribute to Sylvia Pankhurst and the kind of inspiration that she provided. The point I want to end on is that when the First World War broke out, only really a few months after the East London Federation of Suffragettes became an independent organisation, the differences between the East London group and the Women's Social and Political Union became starkly apparent. The WSPU, that said it was prioritising women's issues only, that it was a single issue campaign, in fact suspended its campaign for women's rights and instead supported the preservation of the British Empire and supported the war effort. Sylvia Pankhurst's organisation continued to fight for women's rights in many different forms, not just the right to vote, but also became an anti-war organisation. That initially was a very difficult thing to do. If you think about a place like East London, of course, the employers in that area wanted to make a profit out of the war. They were going to restructure and start producing for the war drive. That meant laying off workers for a couple of weeks because why pay them while they got in new machinery and shifted production. That's an absolute catastrophe for working people that don't have any savings. But of course, at the same time, you've got the government saying, why don't you enlist? You'll get paid. So huge pressure put on working class people to enlist into the forces. It then becomes very difficult to oppose the war. Initially, if your brother, if your husband, your son has joined up to go off to fight. But also, of course, there was a huge amount of jingoistic propaganda, a huge moral pressure to join the drive to war. After all, Germany had invaded Belgium, and the government was saying this was a war in defense of poor little Belgium. Sylvia Pankhurst understood it wasn't that simple, and she placed the war in the context of competitive imperialism. She didn't just see this as something that happened in August 1914. This was the result of the scramble for Africa. This was the result of the arms race and all of those things, and it had to be opposed. She didn't believe that suddenly the government had become friends with the suffragettes. The British government was still the enemy. And this is what she wrote 3 days before the British government joined the war. All sorts of reasons that sound glorious and patriotic are inevitably put forward in support of a declaration of war, but it is practically certain that every war of modern times has been fought with the purely materialistic object of forwarding the schemes and protecting the interests of powerful and wealthy financiers. For Sylvia Pankhurst, this was a new stage of the struggle, and the struggle went on, and she wasn't going to capitulate. This is what I think makes her still a dangerous suffragette for the establishment. But I think the very principled internationalist stance that she took then, which was a very, very brave thing to do, it was a stance based on her understanding of class interests and the way in which those hadn't gone away, but in fact were going to become intensified in the months that came around the war. That's the kind of stance, that's the kind of courage that actually inspires activists, and it's one that we need more urgently than ever today.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Katherine. That was so helpful, and what an inspiring and insightful and incredible woman Sylvia was. And thank you for bringing that to life for us. So thanks to everyone who's joining us. Particularly greetings to comrades tuning in from Ipswich, Milton Keynes, London, Southampton, Ireland and Oxford. We've got around 100 people joining us live, so good to have you all with us. Do keep your comments and questions coming in the chat. We've got about 25 minutes for questions and to explore some of these themes in more detail. Caroline Darmanin on YouTube says, when I was at school, I wrote an essay for my O-levels on Sylvia Pankhurst, and my teacher knew nothing about her, which I fear would be similar today in some cases. Thanks to MGem on Twitter, who says, "How are you spending your lunch hour? I'm learning. Why not join me?" So yeah, that's a good example to us, MGem. And if other people want to share the stream, then please do. What better way to spend a lunch hour? So we're now going to hear very briefly from Ben Hayes, who's a Labour Outlook contributor and Arise Festival volunteer, who's going to tell us a bit more about Arise Festival and what you can do to support, and then we'll come back to Katherine for some questions. Over to you, Ben.
Yeah, thanks very much, Rachel. I'm here to do the sort of Arise Festival's equivalent of the advertising breaks you get on TV. But if you usually make those, make your cup of tea during those, I'd urge you to stick around for this one. Not only because it'll be a bit less than 3 minutes, so you won't have time, but there is important information. Firstly, just to let you know about the next two sessions we've got in this sort of Friday lunchtime slot coming up. So a week today, we've got the economist Michael Roberts discussing what Marx and Engels would have to say about the current crisis. And then on Friday, 23rd of June, the Australian Labour historian Sandra Bloodworth will be joining us for a forum on the Paris Commune, glorious harbinger of a new society. So look forward to those. And Arise is yet to come across any billionaire sponsors, so we are relying on support financially from all of you to use the kind of streaming platforms and things like that for these sessions. If you are able to purchase a ticket for the festival as a whole, I think the links will be posted in the chat. Any contributions are very much appreciated. And just a reminder, you can watch back any sessions you've missed or want to share with your friends on our YouTube and Spotify pages, including this one. So if you want to let people know about this, that's how you can do it. Thank you very much for joining us today for what I thought was a really interesting introduction, and hopefully you'll enjoy the upcoming discussion.
Thanks, Ben. Echo those points about contribute and tune in for further sessions. So I've got two questions on from YouTube and one cheeky one from myself. So firstly, we'll do sort of three at a time if that's all right, and try not to get you to remember too many at once. So the first one, could you say some more on how Sylvia showed foresight in understanding the menace of fascism in Italy and some of the discussions and activities she was involved in on this issue, which, sorry, I cut you a little bit short. We were she moved on to in her later life, didn't she? So it'd be good to hear more about that. Secondly, why is it when we celebrate the lives of historic figures like Sylvia Pankhurst, their radicalism and socialism tends to be ignored? And thirdly, my own question, which is, could you say a bit more about Sylvia's political journey? Because clearly she started off in a place, with her mother and sister who turned out to be complete, unfortunately, rather reactionary in their later years. And, she came from a similar background, obviously, but then expanded her own political framework to include sort of working class movements, and then in her final years more the anti-imperialist movement, a very internationalist approach. So I'm quite interested in how she progressed in that way, where the others progressed in the opposite direction. So just that small little question would be good to address, and over to you again.
Yeah, thank you. Those are great questions. First of all, in terms of the question about her foresight around fascism, I mean, Sylvia Pankhurst was always an internationalist, so she was always very interested in, she was never kind of parochial. She was never, purely interested in the struggle in one country. She didn't see it in that way. But she had particular links to Italy, and especially through Silvio Corio, who was her partner, and her partner probably since 1917. And he was an exile from Italy, a political exile. And so he was he was also a journalist and a printer, so he was very well connected to Italian radicals who knew what was going on there. But also there was her connection via the communists. She was quite close to a number of Italian communists. She went, as we know, to international conferences in Italy, and actually she witnessed some of the fascist violence in 1919 in Bologna, and that's when I think she first records the name Benito Mussolini in her newspaper. So she knew where that was coming from, and also she understood that fascism was the counter-revolution. She'd been inspired by the Russian Revolution, that wave of revolutionary activity that swept Europe, that brought to an end really the First World War. And this was the establishment response. This was a frightened establishment who were looking at what happened to the Tsarist Empire, who didn't want that happening in their countries, and they saw the fascists as a sort of promised return to what was called stability. They believed the fascists were going to crush the left, and this is why people like Churchill were very, very relaxed and even very enthusiastic to see fascist forces initially on the scene. Sylvia Pankhurst obviously didn't take that approach. She understood this was a threat to the kind of revolutionary dreams that had arisen in that period. So she knew what was happening in Italy for all of those reasons. And then she started to try and raise awareness about it, because also there was lots of complacency about it and lots of confusion about what fascism actually was. This, came as quite a new phenomenon, promising new things. So she entered into a big polemic with George Bernard Shaw about this, for example, who was very kind of complimentary in some ways about Italian fascism. And she was saying, you've got this wrong, you have to retract this. So she really understood the nature of it right from the start. And she also, with Silvio Corio, campaigned to kind of against fascist influences in London, in the Italian community there. So that was a big part of her activism, very important. In terms of why the radicalism and the socialism is ignored, I think it's still dangerous. I think that's what it is. This is actually what inspires us. I think, in a way, we could see around the centenary of some women winning the right to vote. So 2018, the centenary of the Representation of the People Act in 1918, which gave the right to vote to women over the age of 30 who fulfilled certain property requirements. There was a celebration of that everyone could get involved in. Theresa May used that as a platform to talk about herself and her place in politics. So I guess is my take on it. So that was something that we were told was just a universal celebration, and I think that's very dangerous, because what it says is these issues in the past. It's a way for the British state to come out of this looking very smug and actually patting itself on the back. If you include Sylvia Pankhurst in the story, then the struggle is unfinished. And that's something the British state are less able to co-opt or incorporate, because it says that the oppressions that were being fought against then are still relevant now. And you think about the kind of things that the East London suffragettes were talking about: low wages, high rents, poor conditions at work, police violence. These are issues that haven't gone away. So I think that's why is my take on it. But I'd be interested to hear what other people think. And just in terms of your question, Rachel, about Sylvia's political journey, which is a really interesting one. I think the reason that there's that divergence in the Pankhurst family is it's different responses to the frustration that's felt by campaigners when a campaign reaches dilemmas, when it hasn't been won. And in particular, I think one of the sort of turning points is when they've undertaken the most kind of significant example of mass action that the Women's Social and Political Union do. In 1908, they're challenged to prove that there's popular support for votes for women by the government. The government says, well, we would grant it, but you don't have popular support, so you don't get the vote. So they organized a massive demonstration, not just a big demonstration, but what was at that point the biggest demonstration in British political history in Hyde Park, and the government just ignored it. So then there's a question that's raised for those suffrage campaigners. What direction do you go in? Do you give up on mass action after that? And that's what Emmeline and Christabel did, I think. Whereas for Sylvia Pankhurst, I think she draws lessons from the Great Unrest that has an important radicalizing effect on her. And there's also the basis for her to try and implement the kind of mass action that she believes is possible. So it's those sort of two things. Of course, that's not the only political development in her life or that we could talk about. There's the fact that she becomes a communist in the First World War. And again, I think that's to do with very real developments that are taking place. She looks at the Soviets in Russia. She sees an example of direct democracy. She sees that as superior to parliament. And that's, in particular, what really inspires her about Russia. She then looks at the big social changes that are made in the aftermath of the revolution, things that, would take such a long time under, a parliamentary democracy. She has arguments with Lenin. She adopts what's called a left communist position. Then there's her later anti-fascism. There's lots and lots of different, very interesting political developments that she has. And yeah, we can maybe talk about some of those, but I'll end there so I don't drone on.
Thanks, Katherine. It's interesting, isn't it? I could do with a few more people going on that same political journey. Couple more for you. So one is to ask whether you see any parallels between the tactics of the suffragettes and the campaigns around Just Stop Oil and things today, and whether there's any parallels you'd like to draw, and what Sylvia's view was of those sort of direct action tactics. Second one, it's good to hear about the revival of interest in Sylvia's life and works, and yet it feels like the women's movement overall is at quite a low ebb, particularly under the Starmer leadership in the Labour Party, going backwards. But yet there's been a sort of wave of industrial action where women are in the front line, nurses, teachers, obviously not all women, but majority women professions. In my own union in UCU, we're still fighting to overturn the gender pay gap. What lessons can we learn from sort of Sylvia's experience in East London about how women can come to the fore in these struggles and make sure they're not always sort of women in the background led by men, and make sure those issues are at the front of our campaigning. And just to say thanks to everyone who's watching on YouTube for your nice comments. So Jan O'Malley said, learned so much, wonderful talk, thanks for organising. And Jeff Taylor says, now keen to read Catherine's book on Sylvia Pankhurst. So you've done a good job of selling that. Before I ask you to sort of come back and make any sort of concluding remarks, can I just thank everyone who's been watching for taking part and making comments and asking questions, and just remind people to buy a ticket for the whole of Arise, a festival of left ideas. And as mentioned, we do need to sell all those tickets to cover the costs of this month, which really is one of the main places we are getting our political education at the moment, and we're very grateful to all the volunteers who make it happen. And if you've already got a ticket, why not become a friend of Arise for £5 a month and help Arise expand? just to remind people that the next discussion in these weekly Socialist Ideas slot is on Marx and Engels and today's capitalist crisis. That's at 1 p.m. on Friday, the 16th of June. And there'll be a major discussion on Palestine on Monday at 6:30 p.m. So do buy a ticket and register for all the events throughout the festival. And Katherine, I'm going to ask you to try and come back on those questions, again, quite wide-ranging, but show how relevant what Sylvia's sort of writings and leading by example, really. She wasn't, you know, you said her main sort of job really was to be a journalist, but she was much more than that, wasn't she? She wasn't just sort of standing on the sidelines commentating. She was right in the heart of the campaigns and leading them, and not just organizing, but leading with her ideas as well, and help, you know, part of that whole left progress across Europe. So sorry, that's just my my take on it. But yeah, if you'd like to sort of sum up and answer those questions, that would be great. And thanks to you again for bringing this to us.
Well, thank you very, very much for really interesting, excellent questions, and thanks to you, Rachel, for sorting those and the whole team for sorting them so calmly. But behind the scene, it's looked seamless. I know it can be. Yeah, thanks for organising the discussion so well. It's been lovely. In terms of the first question about parallels with Just Stop Oil, I think is a really interesting question. And I think the approach to it is, Sylvia gives us a very useful way of thinking about this. I think actually this is one of her contributions that is most useful right now. She had a real dilemma just before she goes to East London and sets up her kind of campaign along her political lines, which was about how to argue for a different way or a different politics in the struggle without seeming to denigrate the efforts of very, very brave activists who were risking their lives for something that she believed in and who were her comrades. And so she always defended the militancy of the suffragettes, and she never joined in with an establishment condemnation of them. And I think that's a really important starting point, that Just Stop Oil and other climate activists are raising awareness about one of the most important issues that faces us, and have been very successful at getting media coverage over that, and it's frightened the establishment. And the establishment, in part as a response to this and also to other things, are trying to criminalize the right to protest as a response. And that's something we need a massive fight back against, as well as a massive movement around climate change. And I guess that's the sort of other side of this, that if we're going to combat climate change, then we need more than some stunts. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily the view of all the activists undertaking these stunts, very visibly, very bravely. But I think that is an important thing to remember. This is something that simply cannot be achieved by a small minority. This is something that we are going to win as the masses. So then the question is, where does direct action fit into that? And what is the value of direct action, civil disobedience, all of those kind of things? And Sylvia, I think, has a really interesting answer to this. She wrote it's there in her books, but it's also there very clearly in a short manuscript in her papers called The Women's Movement of Yesterday and Tomorrow. And there she talked about her thinking about militancy, and her test about whether militant tactics were effective was whether they brought in wider support, whether they galvanize wider support. And she said at the beginning of the suffragette movement, the kind of things the suffragettes were doing inspired people. They made people want to join that campaign, to look up to them, to want to be like them, and to feel that they could participate. That changes towards the end of the campaign because the politics of the campaign change. So the way that militancy is used is not to bring more people on board. In Christabel Pankhurst's view, in her iteration of it, it is to punish the general public for not supporting them. So it becomes something that is undemocratic, that is elitist, and it's hostile to the vast majority of people, and actually says the vast majority of people won't get it. And I think it's really important then that we kind of think about how that, I think that's a very helpful formulation. And I think it's very helpful in terms of thinking about the climate crisis. Are we saying this is because the establishment version of this is that climate change is all our fault, like we're too selfish, we're all just consumers, that's the way that we're regarded, so we're to blame, so there's nothing we can do about it, and that leads, I think, to a very that is very elitist, but it can also trip up some activists into kind of thinking the same thing, that there's only a few people that are able to confront or understand the scale of the problem. And I don't think that's true. I think loads of people are terrified about climate change. So we've got to think about what activities, what actions can bring on board the vast majority of people to fight the big climate polluters in the world. And so I think that is about thinking about this as a class fight. How do we bring on board working class people across the globe who are going, of course, to suffer disproportionately because of this, because we live in a class divided society? That's the challenge. And of course, militancy plays a role there. But we've got to think about, where are we strong? Again, in the workplaces, for example, where can we fight this? So I think that's only part of an answer, but I think that's where Sylvia helps us a bit with that. In terms of the kind of reversals to women's rights that we're experiencing, in terms of Keir Starmer and what's going on at the moment, I want to just say a few things. One is that I don't think actually Keir Starmer his politics are particularly popular. I don't think they resonate with the vast majority of people. I think that's sort of blatantly obvious, really. I think the reason that he is leader of the Labour Party is because he said he was going to kind of continue Corbyn's legacy, which was popular. That proved not to be true. And I think he, like whole sections of the establishment, of which I would count him as one, were terrified by what Jeremy Corbyn represented. And in particular, because the politics that Corbyn stood for did resonate and were so popular. So I think that's important to remember, that although Starmer is obviously witch hunting the left and involved in that, I think is an attack on women's rights, I don't think that this represents what most people think. So I think that's important to remember. And I think we are seeing the resurgence of struggle over these things. It's not to say that we're not being attacked. It's not to say that there haven't been these massive reversals. But what I'm seeing is resistance. And I think that's what we should always look for. We should always look for where the struggle is. There has been actual resistance to the way that police treat women now. I think that's really important. That's really exciting. I think the person who asked the question is absolutely right to talk about the trade union struggle. And of course, it's not inevitable that that's going to deliver results. But I think, therefore, what we've got to think about is strengthening that struggle. I think the worst thing would be for those struggles that are taking place at the moment to be defeated. So the hope is in the struggle, the hope being the hope that we can win. And if we win, that can empower us. It empowers us to take on all sorts of other things that are going on around us. A victory to the nurses, for example, would, I think, inspire workers in all sorts of other workplaces. It would be a win in a workplace where, you know, the majority of the workforce is female, that will have a massive impact in terms of women's confidence, women's rights, and our view of where women's liberation comes from. You know, I talked about those two high points, I think, and when people are really interested in Sylvia Pankhurst and the suffragette movement, it follows patterns of struggle. It did not follow Margaret Thatcher becoming Prime Minister, and, you know, that version of women's rights that tells us, you know, it's all about getting women into important positions. So I think it would be a really important thing if we can see victories in the struggle that is ongoing at the moment. And so I think we need to throw all of our efforts into achieving the best victories that we can achieve on that front. And I think inevitably that will mean empowering the rank and file members in those struggles. That's what that's about, I think, and that's what Sylvia Pankhurst was about. So I'll finish there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Katherine, for those answers and for bringing Sylvia's legacy to life. And I think we could discuss for much longer the sort of relevance of her writings to today's struggles, because even in those last sort of couple of answers, you know, we can see there's a debate to be had, isn't there, about all these things, and how Sylvia would have seen the tactics, because really it is, you know, some of the issues of class and race and women's liberation have they've moved on, but they're essentially quite similar to what was going on 100 years ago or so on. So I do urge people to read more from Sylvia and about Sylvia from Katherine and others, and obviously to join further sessions from Arise. And thanks very much everyone for tuning in, and see you at the next session.